I wasn't looking for anything special. I was just looking for work. The descent hadn't been a sudden cliff fall. It was a long, muddy slide into the kind of poverty that makes you invisible. I'd been laid off 2 months earlier from a logistics firm that had downsized its entire overnight security tier in favor of automated cameras and a single roaming patrol that covered 3 zip codes. I remember the day vividly. The fluorescent lights of the HR office humming with a predatory buzz as they handed me a cardboard box and a 2-week severance check that felt more like an insult than a lifeline. Inside that box was a stapler, a half-empty bottle of aspirin, and a photo of my mother that I hadn't looked at in years. By the time that money ran out, the desperation began to set in. A cold, oily slick that coated every thought. My apartment, once a sanctuary, had become a cage. The landlord, a man whose voice sounded like dry leaves skittering on pavement, had already called twice. The final notice on the door wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a countdown to non-existence. I had spent weeks scouring the bottom-tier job boards, the ones where the fonts are slightly mismatched and the postings feel like they were written by people who don't want to be found. I looked for anything that didn't require a degree I didn't have, or a car that wasn't currently making a death rattle in the parking lot. By the 3rd week of month 2, my standards had hit rock bottom. Overnight, and no experience required. I wanted to be a ghost among ghosts. I wanted a job where I didn't have to explain the hollow look in my eyes to customers or managers. Security jobs were easy enough to find in this city, but they all paid about the same. Bare minimum. $15.50 an hour to stand in a cold lobby or watch a construction site where the most exciting thing that happened was a stray cat knocking over a bucket of nails. It was enough to survive. Barely. But not enough to breathe. I was drowning in the quiet, suffocating way you do when you start choosing between a bus pass and a decent meal. I had reached the point where I was counting out nickels for generic pasta. The hunger, a constant gnawing companion in the dark. That's why the listing on page 12 of a local classified site didn't just stand out. It felt like a hallucination. Overnight security. Private hospital. $47 per hour. Immediate start. At first, I assumed it was a typo. I refreshed the page, waiting for the inevitable correction to $14.70. I checked similar listings in the area, but they remained stagnant. I clicked the post again. Same number, $47. No recruiter name, no company description, no list of preferred qualifications like military experience or a background in law enforcement. Just an address, a start date, and a single line at the bottom that felt less like a requirement and more like a challenge. Applicants must be comfortable working alone. I applied before I could talk myself out of it. My fingers flew across the keyboard, attaching my resume, a document that felt increasingly like a work of fiction, and hitting send before the logical part of my brain could scream, "Scam." The response came less than 10 minutes later. It wasn't an automated "thank you for your interest" email. It was a direct message. No interview, no request for a background check, no "we'll be in touch." Just a time, a location, and a directive to dress for duty. I spent the rest of the day in a state of vibrating anxiety, wondering if I was walking into a kidney harvesting operation or a genuine miracle. At $47 an hour, I decided I didn't much care which it was. The hospital sat nearly 20 miles outside of the city limits, tucked into a geographical dead zone where the streetlights eventually grew tired of following the road. As I drove, the urban sprawl gave way to skeletal trees and dense underbrush that seemed to lean toward the asphalt as if trying to reclaim it. My old sedan felt increasingly vulnerable the further I moved from civilization. The pavement turned to cracked asphalt, then to a packed gravel road that vibrated through my steering wheel, shaking my teeth in my gums. Finally, the silhouette of the building rose against the tree line, illuminated by a moon that looked like a bruised fingernail. It wasn't abandoned, but it looked like it was trying to be. It was a massive, sprawling complex that seemed to be at war with itself architecturally. The central core was Victorian. Red brick, high gabled roofs, and arched windows that looked like hollow eye sockets. Branching off from it were brutalist concrete wings added in the 60s or 70s, their flat, windowless faces stained with decades of rainwater and soot. It looked like a castle that had been grafted onto a bunker. Most of the windows were dark, but here and there, a dim greenish light flickered behind the glass, like the bioluminescence of a deep-sea fish. I parked where the GPS told me to, a small auxiliary lot near the back, hemmed in by a chain-link fence topped with rusted coils of razor wire. No other cars were there, not a single doctor's luxury SUV or a nurse's compact. Just me and the wind whistling through the fence. I checked my phone. No service. The bars had dropped one by one as I crossed the county line, and now the screen was just a glowing brick of useless glass. The employee entrance was a heavy steel door with a wired glass portal. It gave way with a deep metallic groan when I pulled on it. It wasn't locked. In fact, the latch didn't even catch. It just swung open, inviting me into the mouth of the beast. Inside, the atmosphere was thick. It wasn't just the smell, the cloying, sterile scent of industrial bleach layered over something sour and organic. It was the pressure. The air felt heavy, like the atmospheric pressure had shifted the moment I crossed the threshold. The silence was absolute, but it wasn't empty. It was the kind of silence that has a frequency, a low-level hum that vibrates in your molars. I waited at the front desk in the lobby. The marble floor was buffed to a mirror finish, reflecting the sickly yellow glow of the fluorescent lights above. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. I cleared my throat, the sound echoing down the long, divergent hallways like a gunshot. "Hello?" I called out. The building didn't answer. It just breathed, the slow, rhythmic rattle of an ancient ventilation system moving cold, dry air through the empty corridors. I noticed a door labeled security down the hall to the left. It was the only door with a light shining from beneath the frame. Inside was a small, windowless office that felt like a bunker. On the desk sat a folded uniform, a heavy-duty radio, a massive black maglite, and a single sheet of paper. The uniform was a dark, midnight blue. As I picked it up, I realized with a jolt of unease that the name tag was already pinned to the chest. Jason. I stripped off my jacket and put it on. It fit perfectly. The sleeves hit exactly at my wrists. The collar didn't pinch. The trousers were the precise length for my stride. It was as if someone had taken my measurements while I slept. I told myself it was a coincidence, the medium-long standard, but the fabric felt warm, as if it had just come out of a dryer, or as if someone had just taken it off. I sat down at the desk, the leather of the chair creaking under my weight, and unfolded the paper. It was titled, Night Security Procedures. There was no logo, no property of St. Jude's. No contact information for a supervisor. Just 7 rules, printed in a clean serif font that looked disturbingly permanent. Rule 1. Your shift begins at 11 p.m. and ends at 7 a.m. Do not leave the building before your shift ends. Do not allow anyone else to leave the building during this time. I checked my watch. 10:57 p.m. The wording was what got me. Do not allow. It implied a level of physical intervention that my 47-an-hour brain wasn't quite ready for. Who would be trying to leave, and why wouldn't I let them? Rule 2. If the door to room 333 is open, check it immediately. If the patient is asleep in the bed, close the door and continue your rounds. If the patient is not in the bed, return to the security office and call the on-duty nurse. Until the nurse arrives, do not look up. I stopped there. My eyes instinctively flicked toward the ceiling tiles of the office. They were standard acoustic squares, but several were sagging, stained with dark, irregular rings. I forced my gaze back down to the paper. Do not look up. It was a nonsensical instruction, yet in this windowless room, it felt like the most important piece of advice I'd ever received. Rule 3. Between 12 a.m. and 12:30 a.m., the intercom may activate on its own. If you hear your name announced, do not respond. If you hear a name you do not recognize, acknowledge it once by saying, "Security copies." Do not say anything else. A drop of sweat rolled down my neck. They hadn't asked for my name during the application. I had typed it into a form, sure, but who had read it? Who had printed that name tag? Rule 4. During rounds, you may encounter patients who are not listed on your manifest. Do not ask them questions. Do not assist them. If they speak to you first, listen politely and continue walking. They are not looking for help. They are looking for an audience. The manifest sat next to the rules. It was a clipboard with a single sheet of paper listing about 40 room numbers. Next to most of them was a simple X. No names, no conditions, no discharge dates. Just X. Rule 5. If you see a gurney moving through the halls without staff present, step into the nearest room and close the door. Remain inside until the sound stops. Do not check the hallway to confirm. Rule 6. At exactly 3:17 a.m., the lights on floor C will shut off. This is normal. Do not attempt to restore power. If you hear movement after the lights go out, remain where you are until the lights return. Rule 7. If you hear knocking from inside the walls, do not investigate. If the knocking follows you, return to the security office immediately. Lock the door. Turn off the radio. Wait. The final line was printed in a tiny, cramped font, almost like an afterthought. Failure to follow procedures may result in injury, termination, or reassignment. Reassignment, I whispered. My voice sounded thin in the small room. I thought of the X's on the manifest. Were those the reassignments? The radio on the desk crackled, a sharp, violent burst of static that made me jump nearly out of the chair. I looked at the clock. 11 p.m. The night had begun. I clipped the radio to my belt. It felt heavy, a comforting weight on my hip. I gripped the maglite, a solid 3-cell beast that could double as a club, and stepped out of the office. The door clicked shut behind me. It was a soft sound, but it felt final. I tried the handle. Locked. I checked my pockets. No keys. I realized with a jolt that I hadn't been given any. I was outside the office, and according to the rules, I couldn't leave the building. The hallway stretched out before me like a long, pale throat. The floor was white tile, the walls were eggshell, and the ceiling was a grid of flickering tubes. There were no windows to the outside world here, only doors. Hundreds of identical, heavy wooden doors with small brass numbers. My boots sounded like hammer strikes on the tile. Clack, clack, clack. I spent the first 40 minutes of my shift walking the perimeter of the first floor. Every hallway looked like the last. I started to notice the details. The way the baseboards were scuffed at exactly the same height as a gurney wheel. The way the air smelled different in front of certain doors. In front of room 112, it smelled like ozone and burnt hair. In front of room 118, it smelled like fresh-cut grass, an impossibility in a windowless concrete wing. I didn't stop to investigate. I just kept walking. At 11:12 p.m., I passed the stairwell to floor B. I stood at the heavy fire door and listened. From somewhere deep below, I heard the sound of water, a steady, rhythmic dripping that sounded like a metronome. Drip, drip, drip. I kept moving. I had to find room 333. The third floor was part of the older wing. The transition was jarring. The floors changed from tile to worn, dark linoleum. The air grew colder, smelling of damp earth and old medicine. The walls here were covered in a faded floral wallpaper that seemed to peel away from the plaster in long, skin-like strips. I found the door. 333. It was open. Not wide, just cracked about 3 inches. A vertical sliver of absolute darkness against the dim light of the hall. My heart was doing a frantic dance. Check it immediately. I approached the door, my hand trembling, and pushed. The door swung inward on silent hinges. The room was cold, not just AC cold, but the kind of cold that feels like it's stealing the heat directly from your blood. I clicked on my flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating a standard hospital bed. A man lay there. He was thin, his skin the color of wet parchment, stretched tight over his cheekbones. He was lying on his side, facing the wall. Hiss, click, hiss, click. The ventilator was an old model, a clunky machine with bellows that moved up and down like a mechanical lung. He was there. He was asleep. I began to back out, relieved, when my flashlight beam swept upward. The ceiling tiles above his bed were gone. There was just a square of black void. And from that void, I saw something. Just a movement. A shift in the darkness that looked like a long, pale limb withdrawing into the shadows. Do not look up. I lowered the light instantly and grabbed the door handle and pulled. It shut with a firm thud. The walk back to the security office felt miles longer than the walk away. I felt eyes on the back of my neck, a heavy predatory gaze that seemed to originate from the ceiling vents. I kept my chin tucked to my chest. I stared at the tiles. I counted the cracks. 12 tiles to the next light fixture. 8 tiles to the intersection. I didn't look at the doors. By 11:58 p.m., I was back in the security office. I checked the monitors. The screens were filled with grainy black and white images of empty hallways. The clock on the wall ticked to 12 o'clock. The intercom system, an ancient thing with a brass mesh cover, hummed to life. The static was thick, sounding like 100 people whispering at once. "Jason." The voice was soft. It sounded like it was coming from inside my own head. It was my mother's voice, exactly as it had sounded before she passed away. Jason, I'm in room 412. I can't find my glasses, honey. It's so dark. Why won't you come see me? My throat tightened. My eyes burned. I reached for the button. My thumb was a millimeter away when Rule 3 flashed in my mind. Do not respond. I pulled my hand back, my heart hammering against my ribs. Jason, are you there? Please, it's so dark in here. I closed my eyes and counted to 10. The static flared, a violent screech of electronic feedback, then smoothed out. A new voice came through, deep and guttural. Arthur Pendell, Ward 7. I didn't recognize the name. It wasn't on the manifest. I took a breath, my voice cracking. Security copies, I said. The intercom clicked off instantly. I looked at the monitor for the lobby. A man was standing there now. He was wearing a suit from the 1940s, sharp lapels, a pocket square that looked like a splash of blood, and a fedora pulled low over his eyes. He wasn't moving. He was just staring directly into the camera lens. He didn't blink. Then, the monitor flickered to static. When it cleared, he was gone. At 12:45 a.m., I forced myself back out. The office felt like a cage, but the hallways felt like a throat. I was walking the second-floor corridor when I saw her. A woman was standing in the middle of the hall. She was wearing a thin gown that looked like gauze, so thin it was translucent. Her hair was long, matted, and damp. She was facing away from me, her head tilted at a sharp, unnatural angle, almost resting on her shoulder. Rule 4, do not assist. I kept walking. My boots sounded like thunder in the silence. As I passed her, I kept my eyes fixed on the far end of the hall. I could feel her presence. A cold, stagnant aura that smelled like pond water and stagnant lilies. It's so heavy, she whispered. Her voice was right in my ear, though she hadn't moved. I didn't stop. The water in my lungs. It's so heavy, Jason. Won't you help me carry it? I didn't answer. I can feel the fish, she said, her voice bubbling as if she were speaking through liquid. They're small. They nibble at the soft parts. I turned the corner, my pace quickening. I didn't look back, but I heard wet footsteps behind me. Slop, slop, slop. They followed me for 20 yards, then stopped. At 1:15 a.m., the sound of the gurney began. It started as a distant metallic rattle, echoing from the far end of the north wing. Then, the rhythmic squeak grind of a bad wheel. It was a sound I knew from every hospital movie I'd ever seen, but here, it was physical. I remembered Rule 5. I ducked into the nearest room, room 214. I shut the door and stood in the dark. I didn't turn on my light. I pressed my ear to the wood. The sound grew louder. It wasn't just a gurney. There were other sounds, the clinking of surgical instruments against a metal tray, and a wet, tearing sound, like someone pulling apart a roast chicken. The gurney passed the door. I could see the shadow of it moving through the gap at the bottom. It was a long, jagged shadow that looked like a carriage made of bone. It stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. I stood perfectly still, my hand over my mouth to stifle my breathing. Something tapped on the door. 1, 2, 3. Then, a voice like two stones rubbing together. We have a vacancy, Jason. Would you like to see the accommodations? I didn't breathe. I stared at the floor, watching the shadow beneath the door. A pale, multi-jointed finger slid under the door, questing for my boot. It was long, with too many knuckles, and the skin was the color of a fish's belly. I backed away, hitting the empty bed frame with a loud clack. The finger withdrew instantly. The gurney began to move again, the squeak grind fading until it was swallowed by the hum of the building. I stayed in room 214 for 45 minutes. I sat on the floor, my back against the bed frame. I thought about the $47 an hour. I calculated how many hours I had left. $47 times 6. $282. That was the electricity bill. That was a week of groceries. I could do this. I had to do this. By 3 a.m., the hospital had stopped trying to be a hospital. The geometry was failing. Stairwells went up for 5 flights when there were only 3 floors. Corridors that should have led to the lobby led back to the same vending machine room. I was on floor C, the basement level. This was the morgue level. The walls here were unpainted concrete, weeping with condensation. The air was so cold I could see my breath in the beam of my mag light. At exactly 3:17 a.m., the lights vanished. It wasn't just a power outage. It was the kind of darkness that felt physical, like being buried in warm soot. Rule 6. Remain where you are. I stood perfectly still. I closed my eyes. Then came the movement. It was a crawl. Something was dragging itself along the floor, a heavy, wet sound. It stopped right in front of me. I could feel the heat coming off it. A rancid, oily heat that smelled like a slaughterhouse. Something brushed against my shin. It was cold, wet, and felt like a tongue. A whisper brushed against my ear. "You're very good at following instructions, Jason. But do you know why we have rules?" I didn't answer. "The rules aren't here to keep you safe," the voice hissed. "They're here to keep you delicious. Fear seasons the marrow." The lights snapped back on at 3:19. The hallway was empty, but on the floor was a wet, glistening trail of slime that led directly to the wall and vanished. I fled floor C. I didn't care about the rules for a moment. I just wanted to see light. I reached the security office at 4:30 a.m. The door was closed. Locked. I rattled the handle. "Open up," I shouted. My voice sounded small. Thump. The sound came from inside the wall to my left. Thump, thump. It followed me as I ran toward the lobby. It was rhythmic, persistent. Rule 7. Return to the security office immediately. I doubled back. This time, when I reached the office, the door swung open on its own. I dove inside and slammed the bolt home. I turned off the radio. I turned off the flashlight. I sat in the absolute dark. The knocking began on the office door at 5:15 a.m. Tap, tap, tap. "Jason, the water is rising. Let me in." Then, "Jason, I'm awake now. I'd like to see your face." The walls began to pulse, the plaster cracking as if something were trying to hatch. I curled into a ball in the chair. Security copies. Security copies. I don't know how long I sat there. The voices merged into a single discordant roar that vibrated the very floor beneath me. Then, silence. I opened my eyes. A sliver of gray light was filtering through the gaps in the doorframe. I checked my watch. 7:01 a.m. I unlocked the door. The hospital was a hospital again. The air was sterile. The lights were steady. A nurse in crisp white scrubs was walking down the hall, carrying a clipboard. She smiled at me. "Rough first night?" she asked. I just nodded, unable to find my voice. "The coffee is in the break room. You can leave your report on the desk." On the front desk sat an envelope. Inside was a check for $376. At the bottom, in the memo line, It said, "See you tonight." I walked out to my car. The sun was rising, a pale, weak thing. I drove back to the city, the silence of the road feeling like a scream. I told myself I wouldn't go back, but then I got home and saw the red final notice taped to my door. I looked at the check, $376 for one night. I looked at my phone. I had a new message from an unknown number. "The uniform is being laundered. Rule 8 will be on the desk tonight. Don't be late, Jason. The patients are looking for an audience." I checked the time. 4 p.m. I started getting dressed. The pay was enough to breathe, even if the air I was breathing belonged to something else. Night 2 began with a heaviness in my chest that no amount of generic coffee could fix. I arrived at 10:45 p.m. The gravel road felt longer tonight. The building didn't just look large, it looked hungry. I entered the security office. The uniform was there, folded. The name tag was blank. Next to the radio sat a new sheet of paper. Rule 8. If you find a patient's personal item in the hallway, a shoe, a comb, a pair of glasses, do not touch it with your bare hands. Use the provided red bags in the supply closet. Take the item to the basement incinerator immediately. Do not listen to the item if it begins to vibrate. I found the supply closet. It was filled with rolls of heavy-duty red plastic bags. They smelled of sulfur. I clipped a roll to my belt and began my rounds. The West Wing was silent, but the air felt humid. At 12:15 a.m., I saw it. A single red high-heeled shoe sitting perfectly upright in the middle of the corridor near room 333. It was elegant, expensive, and completely out of place. I stopped 10 feet away. The hum started, a low-frequency vibration that rattled my bones. I pulled a red bag from my belt. As I stepped closer, the shoe began to move. It didn't slide, it shuddered. "Please," a woman's voice hissed from inside the heel. "He's still holding my foot. If you burn me, I'll never find my way back. Please, Jason, look at me." The voice sounded exactly like a girl I had known in high school. I didn't look. I pulled the bag over my hand like a glove and snatched the shoe. It was hot, scorching to the touch even through the plastic. The shoe began to kick. It hit the inside of the bag with the force of a hammer. 1, 2. 1, 2. I bolted for the freight elevator. I hit the button for floor C. The machine groaned. The light turned red. The walls of the elevator began to sweat black oil. "Reassignment," the metal groaned. The doors opened on floor C. It was pitch black. I ran toward the incinerator, the orange glow of the furnace my only guide. "Don't do it, Jason," the shoe screamed, the voice now sounding like my mother. "Don't let them burn me again." I threw the bag into the flames. The scream that erupted from the furnace shattered the glass in my mag light. The fire turned a brilliant, impossible violet. I backed away, falling into the dark. Something touched my neck, a cold, thin finger that traced my jugular. "Good witness," a voice whispered. I stayed in the security office until 7 a.m. When the nurse arrived, she didn't smile. She just handed me the envelope. "Night 3 requires a memory," she said. I went home. I tried to remember the name of my first pet. A dog. I could see the wagging tail, but the name was gone. It had been replaced by a static hum. I tried to remember my mother's face. It was blurred. The hospital was eating my past to pay for my future. Night 3 began at the 4th floor, the Victorian core, The air was thick with incense. I sat in the observation room, a circular chamber filled with CRT monitors. On the desk was a leather-bound ledger. Rule 9. Watch the monitors. If you see yourself, do not look away. Apologize until the screen goes black. At 1:04 a.m., the center monitor flickered. There I was, sitting in the chair. But the me on the screen was wearing a crown made of surgical needles. He turned and looked into the camera. His eyes were solid black pits of ink. "I'm sorry," I whispered. My voice was a tremor. The screen me stood up and walked toward the camera until his bloated black eye filled the entire monitor. I could hear his breathing, a wet, heavy rasp. "I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry," I shouted. The screen snapped to black, but the shadows in the room began to crawl across the floorboards. Rule 10. Offer a memory. If the memory is not painful enough, they will take the person it belongs to. I thought of the day my father left. I offered the memory of his taillights fading into the rain. I felt the sensation dissolve. The shadows coiling around my legs drank it. I offered the memory of my first love. I felt her name slip away. I gave up every moment of joy I had ever known. By 5 a.m., I was a hollow vessel. I knew I was Jason, but I didn't know who Jason was. I didn't know why I was here. I only knew that I had to witness. When 7 a.m. came, the nurse touched my cheek. Her hand was vibrant, full of life. Mine was gray. "You're empty now," she whispered. "The ledger is clear. You don't have to go home anymore, Jason. Home is a memory you don't own." I didn't go back to my car. I walked to the security office and sat down. My face in the mirror was a smooth, pale mask. No eyes, no mouth, just a witness. The radio crackled. "Jason, the new recruit is in the lobby. He looks just like you used to. Show him the rules." I picked up the radio. I didn't have a voice, but the building spoke for me. "Security copies," I whispered through the static. "I am the superintendent now. I am the reason the gurney squeaks. I am waiting for you to read the rules. I am waiting for you to need the $47 an hour. Don't be late. I am very, very hungry for a memory."